Now, this is very bad news, obviously very bad news. It should be obvious to most people anyway.
So we got some good news this week that the FDA is considering a proposal to allow birth control over the counter. Right now, you need a prescription, and medical experts like the American Medical Association say that's unnecessary. It'd be a big help for public health if you could just get it after talking to a pharmacist or self-screening for any potential risks, for adults to be able to make their own decisions. This would seem, right, Hannah, like something that conservatives and supporters of free markets and individual liberty would herald. Whatever your position on abortion, more birth control means fewer unintended pregnancies, fewer abortions, and it's a win for free markets, personal responsibility, and all that. So I was hoping the right would celebrate this, and a lot of people have, but our favorite, Hannah, Matt Walsh over at the Daily Wire, is actually unhappy about this news and is railing against it on his latest podcast.
I mean, am I supposed to be shocked here? I'm not shocked. I will say this is an issue you and I have been covering for some time. We don't typically really get in the mix of the whole abortion debate because it's very messy, very nuanced. We have covered it from time to time on our show. But what you and I have focused our attention on is ways to prevent unwanted pregnancies, because at base, we believe in getting to the root cause of problems. Anytime you're looking at public policy solutions, you need to be looking at things that will actually get to the root problem. And so often we don't do that. Instead, we treat symptoms of problems, which abortion is one, right? If you don't want abortions, it's pretty naive to think that simply banning them will make them go away. Black markets do not work. Product and service bans do not work. You will always have supply when there is demand. And so if you actually want to really actually meaningfully reduce abortions, you would want to make sure that we had good education for people so they knew how to not get pregnant, and that they had access to contraception so that they could have a safe and healthy sex life without having to risk unwanted pregnancies. And largely, we have seen those two things, even before Roe v. Wade was overturned, increase throughout the culture over the past 2-3 decades. And because of that, abortions were already at a very severe downward trajectory. So this should be something that anybody who is truly pro-life would celebrate. But I have to say, sometimes, when I hear the left criticize the right and accuse them of having certain motivations, I think they're really off base. But I've heard many on the left say that some of the intentionality behind getting rid of Roe v. Wade comes from the fact that not only do certain politicians on the right want to make sure that women have to have kids and have more kids, but specifically that they want white women to have more kids, and that really that's whose birth rate is decreasing, which is largely true. It's the white population that's seeing a larger decrease in its birth rate than other communities. And I have to say, as much as I wish this weren't true, when you hear people like Matt Walsh and others who come out and say some of these things really get down to it, it really does start to sound that way to me, because they're not talking about the root cause. They're not talking about trying to actually ensure we don't have unwanted pregnancies in a way that's safe and effective. They're actually talking about trying to force people to have kids, right? That's the ultimate thing here.
Their stated concern is a decline in population. So that's what Matt went with. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Now, this is very bad news, obviously very bad news. It should be obvious to most people anyway. And the reason is that, we have been in this country below replacement level since probably the early 70s. What counts as replacement level, that can vary depending on who you talk to. But since about the early 70s, we've been below population replacement level. Last year, in 2021, saw the slowest population growth in U.S. history. 75% of counties in this country lost population. First time that's ever happened. Total growth was 0.1%, which is definitely below replacement level. And that is one of the many reasons why I don't celebrate any news about more accessible birth control.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that. I will say this, population decline is not an illegitimate concern. You want a growing population in an economy, right? That's very important. But I'm not sure how much that really has to do with birth control. There's lots of other solutions. For example, one I don't know that Matt Walsh would be with us on, let's simply, allow some more immigration to the United States. We've got a long list of high-skilled people, doctors, engineers, people who love America, waiting to come here from places like India. They're backlogged. It'll take 100 years before they would come up in the lists and the queues. Why not bring in more successful people and grow America that way? So I think we should focus on things like that, rather than argue that in order to have a growing population, we shouldn't be making birth control more accessible. I just think that's a huge stretch.
Well, again, to me, it just seems like you're saying the quiet part out loud and that you want population growth among certain populations and you don't want other populations coming in. I mean, that's really all I can hear when I hear things like that, because there are plenty of people who want to come here, who want to work. There are plenty of places where we don't see a decrease in birthing rates. And I think as a whole, that when you do see a decrease in the birth rate, and this is something other people have talked about, like Elon Musk, and I agree, it's not a non-problem. But when you see that, again, you should be looking to solve the root cause of that problem, not trying to use the government or bans on products to force people into behavior you wish to see, right? The behavior you want to see here is objectively more women choosing to have more babies. But instead of addressing the problems for why they're choosing to not do that and would choose to access birth control, instead, people like this want to come in and use the government to prevent them.
Yeah, so I've always thought that if you're pro-life, and I consider myself pro-life, I would support some kinds of bans and restrictions on abortion. We've talked about this before, but I've always said if you're going to do that, you should want to be making birth control as accessible as possible to reduce unintended pregnancies and to help women exercise as much as autonomy and control over their lives as they can without having to take the life of an unborn baby, if that's how you see it, if you are pro-life. And it always frustrates me when pro-life people aren't also pro-birth control, because it's very counterproductive. You should certainly, even if you're not personally a fan of birth control, you have every right to your opinion. But when you're trying to make it harder for others to get it, you're being very counterproductive if your real goal is to reduce abortions. And I also think that people like Matt, he's about to say, he doesn't even think this is a real problem, that anyone has trouble getting it. And I think from what we know about free markets, and we know that adding extra steps requires you to go to a doctor, pay more to see a doctor, much easier if you have health insurance, multiple trips, makes it a lot more expensive, and just puts up a bunch of barriers and hurdles that you don't have in a free market. So take a listen to his second point here, because I think you're going to have some thoughts on it, Hannah.
The whole idea that birth control is inaccessible, or there's a lack of birth control, or it's hard for people to get their hands on birth control, like that the whole idea is completely absurd and nonsensical. The options for birth control for anyone who wants it are plentiful. Unless you live out in the wilderness, 100 miles from the nearest town, and there's not very many places you can go in this country to live somewhere like that, and not very many people do. But unless you live in a situation like that, birth control is very accessible to you. Like you can get a form of birth control, of contraceptive at almost any gas station.
So Hannah, gas stations don't sell birth control pills, and if he's talking about condoms are nowhere near as effective. They're not as reliable. It's not the same thing. And I'm just like, how many times has Matt Walsh tried to obtain birth control? I would love to know. How did he become such an expert in access to this product?
It sounds like never, because this is not, I mean, even when he says not very many people live rurally in America, that you don't have access to contraception. What? Do you know have you heard of the medical deserts that we have in this country, and just how many people have to drive miles and miles and miles to get to a GP, much less a specialist, which you currently have to go to get a prescription through a gynecologist? Like, everything about this is just totally incorrect. And I think any woman would find this absolutely laughable, because the reality is, and I've detailed this at Base Politics, I've detailed this on our podcast, even as a woman who is, higher middle class, who has great insurance, who has every bit of means in the world, I still have to jump through a lot of hoops and barriers to get birth control when I want it. It can take up to a month. For me, that's a hoop to jump through. For some people, that's something that they absolutely cannot manage to do, especially if they don't have health insurance. They can't afford to go see a gynecologist. They can't afford to pay for birth control every month. Like, it is something that actually is a tremendous barrier. And regardless, it takes time even now to access that. And so I think that that's bogus, first and foremost. But secondarily, I think it's hypocritical, because in one breath, he's saying that we don't want to make birth control over the counter because it shouldn't be easier to get, because we don't want people to have more access to it. And then the next breath, he's saying, but it's not that hard to get anyway. It's like, make up your mind.
Make up your mind.
Yeah. Like, which one is it? I know which one it is, and it's definitely not the picture that he's painting here. But again, I want to circle back to what I said a minute ago, which is that, there's nothing here being said to address the root reason of why women are choosing to not have kids anymore. And there's a ton of reasons that they are making these choices. I've actually talked about this at FEE and in numerous other places as well, because I'm somebody who doesn't want to have kids. I've never wanted to have kids, and I'm pretty attuned to these discussions and the childless by choice movement and some of these things. And I think that while that's a choice that I've made and knew since I was very little, I just simply did not want to have kids. I think for other women, they might choose to have kids. They might really want that, but there are real obstacles in their way, specifically government barriers that are preventing them, or cultural barriers too, that are preventing them from making those choices. And so you've got to start looking at a lot of the psychology around it. Psychology Today actually finds and reports numerous studies that childless unmarried women are the happiest in society today. That's an indictment on marriage and childbirth. And I don't think that it has to be that way. But I do think that as women have increasingly actually gotten an equal footing, they don't have to have men to open bank accounts or businesses or get a credit card anymore. They have real choices now. They are now looking and saying, what do I get from this arrangement? What do I get out of this? And as a whole, we find that not just in the US, in many Western countries, specifically Japan, which is having a real issue with this, women are saying, you know what, I'm expected to work. I'm expected to help pay the bills. I'm expected to try to be all things to all people. And the simple reality is that I cannot. I cannot adequately do all of these things to the degree that I want to be able to do them well. And so I'm going to pick and choose. They're saying that even when they do have kids and get married and they're still working, they're doing more of the household work. They're doing more of the child rearing than men working the same amount of hours as them. And so culturally, men have some catching up to do in our society, where when you're no longer the breadwinner, that's not really what you're bringing to the table anymore. What are you bringing to the table now? And it needs to be picking up some of the slack in those regards. And as a whole, we just don't see men really stepping into that role right now.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I also think that taking away women or making it harder for women to access birth control is not the right way to go about encouraging people to have more kids. That's just going to lead more desperate women to go to California and get abortions, right? Because even with Roe gone, many blue states are going to have abortion accessible. So I think that restricting birth control in this context will just mean more abortions, and it's not pro-life at all. It's not pro-liberty. I know Matt is opposed to vaccine mandates. We agree with him on that because we ultimately do believe, in the idea of your body, your choice when it comes to taking a medication or doing something, individual liberty. These are the things you'll hear this crowd espouse. But that certainly extends to the right to take hormonal birth controls without having to jump through all sorts of hoops, when studies have shown you can self-screen, you can talk to a pharmacist, it's safe, it would reduce costs. And then the real reasons, if you want to talk about promoting childbirth, let's talk about paid family leave policies. We can have these debates, what can society do? Because I am somebody who thinks that there's a lot of value in family. And in the American family, I definitely view the family different than somebody like Matt Walsh, because he has a very traditional view of what that means. But I think families are good. Parenting is good. Obviously, we need future generations. But pushing or coercing people into reproducing when they're not ready is not the right way to go about that, rather than asking, like you're saying, what are the reasons that they're not having kids and what can we do to address it? Because I have friends who even work in the conservative movement who didn't have maternity leave at their pro-family, conservative, nonprofit, think tank, media outlets, what have you. And it's clearly there's a lot we could do to actually empower women to have kids when they want to, and be able to without having to compromise and give up so much and struggle without the support. But of course, just forcing them to become pregnant or forcing them into abstinence, none of these are realistic methods. And they're also just giving life to the left's straw man of, pro-lifers just want to control women's bodies. That's generally untrue. I think they earnestly don't want to, at least in their view, they don't want to control women's bodies. They want to protect another person. But they're fine with, the woman living however they want, getting birth control, most of them. But then people like Matt Walsh take the most extreme position possible. And I think they really do the entire cause kind of a disservice in that.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that you hear all these people making Handmaid's Tale comparisons and saying this is what they're trying to push us into, and that's largely not true. It's a very, very fringe minority of people on the right who don't believe in contraception and don't want women to have birth control. But when you have somebody with this kind of following come out and say this, it definitely plays into the left's fear-mongering around this and actually kind of moves us away from having a conversation, again, over the root causes of why people are not having kids or why they're having abortions. And there's a lot that could be done. You're right. I'm a pastor's kid. I grew up in the Christian movement. a lot of churches, a lot of Christian schools, a lot of these kinds of affiliations don't offer maternity leave, don't have very good like remote work policies for mothers. And so while I don't think government should be mandating any of this, I certainly think that we as in our communities should be stepping up and finding ways to make it more convenient for people to have kids, make it more affordable. As far as public policy goes, I think moving more away from labor unions and more towards like remote work kind of structures for work and encouraging that and incentivizing that, trying to look at things like school choice that would give parents actual options in how their kids are raised, so not having to go to government indoctrination camps for 8 hours a day, getting rid of many of the regulations around daycare and childcare that make it so drastically expensive, getting rid of the government's involvement in the healthcare market that make healthcare very expensive for kids. All of these things are things that could be done to where people would voluntarily choose to have more kids. And so I do think there's a public policy response. I think there's a cultural response. And I think as a whole, this is the conversation we should be having, because until we do, it's going to continue to get worse. Because I promise you, women out here are thriving. We're not suffering out here in today's society. Who's suffering are isolated men who can't find women to create families with. Who's suffering are kids who don't have two-parent homes. And who's suffering as a whole is our society and our economy, because we don't have strong families, and we do see more and more people choosing to stay single. And so that is something that needs to be confronted. But I think the problem is that when we come at from force, you're never going to have this conversation. It's going to shut down anybody who's open to exploring these things immediately. And again, in the process, more babies are going to be killed ultimately, because you were trying to use force to change people's behaviors versus actually finding ways to provide solutions to the problem that you have.
Yeah, look, I think that's it in a nutshell. That's enough Matt Walsh for one day. Everybody, we discussed the issue of over-the-counter birth control and the policy elements there in depth in our latest podcast. The link will be in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this, like, comment. If you didn't enjoy this, comment. Let us know what you think. We know that there's a lot of you out there. Say hi to Hannah's dog. And with that, we'll see you all in the next video.